My true story from Alaba. My daughter-in-law moved her parents in and told me, "You can sleep in the shed." I did. For one night. Then I froze the mortgage account. "Be a damn burden somewhere else," she snapped, her voice cutting through the clink of forks and plates like a blade. My daughter-in-law stood across the table, arms folded, face flushed with irritation. "We don't have room for your broken bones and your damn memories here." I kept chewing. My son didn't even flinch at her outburst. He was sprawled on the couch, one leg draped over the other, eyes still glued to his phone. "Why didn't he just marry someone his own age?" he said, half laughing. "Now we got two old fools to take care of." The children were silent. I don't know if they even understood the cruelty in the room. They were too busy swiping through TikTok videos, slurping soda, the sound of my humiliation background noise to their scrolling. I sat at the dining table, my table once, before I put the deed in my son's name to help him qualify for the loan. I ate slowly, chicken thighs I'd seasoned and baked myself, dry now that the air had gone heavy. "You think we're made of money?" she added. "We pay the mortgage, the utilities, the internet. You just sit there all day. You don't cook, you don't clean, you just exist." I looked at her. My daughter-in-law, who I had once welcomed like a daughter, who I hugged on the day of her wedding, with tears in my eyes because I thought, finally, my son has someone who will love him fully. She glared back like I was an unpaid bill that kept showing up in the mailbox. "You've had your time," she said. "Now it's ours." My son set his phone down and leaned forward. "She's right, Ma. I mean, come on. You were the backbone once, we know that. But now, you're just extra. And if you want your own room, your own space, then maybe start contributing. Or, learn how to disappear like a decent person." I felt something inside me go still. It wasn't new, not exactly. This tension had been building for months. Ever since they moved her parents in, I had been edged farther and farther into the shadows of this house. My house. The one I scrubbed tile by tile after my husband died. The one I painted 3 times to keep the walls from looking as tired as I felt. And now I was told to vanish. She pushed her plate forward with a sigh. "The shed's clean. You can take your things out there tonight. We put a cot in there. Be grateful." My fork hovered halfway to my mouth. I finished chewing. I swallowed, and then I said calmly, "I understand." The words hung in the air like frost. I looked around the table. My son, who used to run to me with scraped knees and math homework, his wife, who used to call me Mama M and ask for my banana bread recipe, the children, who barely looked up anymore. I chewed the last bite of my dinner slowly, deliberately. I stood up, took my plate to the sink, rinsed it under cold water. I walked to my room. No, not mine anymore. The guest room. The room they said was better suited for someone my age. I packed a small bag, just the essentials. Then I walked out to the shed. The cot sagged. The window was cracked. There was a bulb overhead that flickered, and a faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. I sat on the cot and looked at my hands. Wrinkled, dry, still steady. I did not cry. I pulled the old banker's box from beneath the cot. The one they forgot I'd stored there when they cleaned out my closet. Inside. Tax documents, mortgage statements, and the original loan agreement, signed by me, still holding partial ownership of the house. They never removed me. They just assumed I was too old, too tired, too weak to remember. But I remembered everything. I stayed up most of the night, reading by the flickering light, making a list in a small notebook I kept tucked in my cardigan, a list of calls to make, rights to assert, documents to retrieve. By sunrise, I had a plan. Let them think I was just a burden. They were about to learn how heavy I could truly be. The first night in the shed was colder than I expected. They had tossed an old blanket over the cot, the kind you find balled up in the back of a closet during spring cleaning. The fabric scratched my skin and did little to stop the night air that crept in through the cracked window and under the door. I kept my coat on and curled my legs in tight, trying to find warmth in a space that had never known comfort. Outside, the motion sensor light kept flicking on and off. Startled by wind or squirrels, each time it lit up the shed through the slats, I saw the outline of my former home, the kitchen where I used to make cornbread, the back porch where Robert and I once slow danced under string lights, the living room where my grandchildren used to fall asleep on my lap during movies. Now I was here, a visitor to my own history. The air smelled like old oil and forgotten tools. I did not cry, but I did not sleep either. I watched the shadows shift until morning. When I opened the door at sunrise, the world was already moving without me. My son pulled out of the driveway without so much as a glance in my direction. My daughter-in-law came outside to check on her father's new recliner delivery, walked right past me as if I were a mailbox. The grandkids rode their scooters through the yard, nearly clipping the edge of the shed, too busy laughing to notice me standing there like an uninvited ghost. I sat by the garage for a while that morning, pretending to enjoy the sun. The garage didn't have a working door anymore, just a tarp, and they had filled most of it with storage bins. No one asked why I was there. That afternoon I swept the patio. No one asked me to. I wiped down the outdoor grill. I watered the potted plants, some of which I planted myself years ago. Still, no one said a word. I spent most of that week drifting between the garage, the back steps, and the shed. I wasn't allowed back in the main house unless I needed the bathroom. Even then, I heard the whispers behind the doors. She needs to learn boundaries. She's being dramatic. Maybe we should just get her a tiny home and put it in the back lot, as if I were a stray dog. That's when I started to remember. Not out of spite, but clarity. I remembered the day I co-signed the mortgage. My son was young, scared, and underpaid. The bank said he needed a guarantor. I was still working part-time then. Robert had just passed and the house felt too quiet, so I said yes. I signed my name beside his, and I never took it off. They must have forgotten that part, or assumed I had. But I had not. One night in the shed, I dug through a box beneath the cot. Old envelopes, tax forms, yellowing folders, and there it was, the original mortgage agreement. My name, clear as day, beside his, joint owner, not co-signer, not temporary owner. I turned the page and saw the deed. An addendum signed but never filed. One they had meant to submit to remove me from the title. Never notarized, never finished. They got lazy. They thought I was finished. That night, with the wind rattling the window pane, I opened my old phone. The screen was cracked, and the battery barely held charge, but it could still connect to the internet. I searched, Alabama Property Law Joint Mortgage. Then, how to freeze mortgage account as co-owner. Then, rights of aging homeowners with title stake. I spent hours scrolling, reading, learning. Not for revenge, but for preparation, because I was not going to rot in that shed while they enjoyed the home I built. The home they were still legally sharing with me. They called me a burden, but I still had weight, and now I was going to use it. The next morning I called Sarah. She was the daughter of Robert's old attorney, and I had met her once years ago, back when Robert and I updated our wills after his second heart scare. Back then she was young, fresh out of law school, nervous in a way that made me like her. I remembered her name because she'd written me a thank you card after that meeting. I wasn't sure she'd remember me, but she did. "Mrs. Smith?" she said after a pause. "Of course I remember. How can I help?" I told her I had a few questions, nothing urgent, just curiosity. Within the hour, I had emailed her scanned copies of the mortgage agreement, the unsigned deed revision, and a list of dates and conversations I had jotted down in the shed. I didn't mention the insult or the cold nights. I didn't need to. I just told her I wanted to know what my rights were, legally, not emotionally. She called back the next day. "You're not just a co-signer," she said gently. "You're a joint owner. And based on what you sent me, it appears they never removed you from title." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "You have every right," she continued, "to request a temporary injunction if you believe your rights are being violated." That word sat heavy in my chest. Rights. It had been a long time since someone reminded me I had any. After we hung up, I opened the small wooden box I kept tucked in the bottom of my suitcase. Inside were a few old photos, Robert's wristwatch, and a folded napkin from the diner where my son had asked me for help all those years ago. He was 29, broke, and terrified of losing the house before it was even his. His hands trembled as he sipped his coffee. "I don't have anyone else, Ma," he'd said. "You're the only one I trust." I remembered the pride in his eyes when I said yes. when I walked into that bank and signed my name next to his. I remembered how he hugged me afterward and whispered, "I'll never forget this." But he had. They both had. They looked at me now and saw a leftover. But I was not a remnant. I was an investor, a stakeholder, a woman who still had a name on the deed. Sarah sent over a basic draft of the injunction. I read it 3 times before signing. It was simple, really, just a request to prevent unilateral decisions about the property without my consent. A pause, a freeze, a way to remind them that this home still carried my fingerprints. Once the papers were ready, Sarah filed them on my behalf. The bank would be notified, so would the mortgage company, and eventually, so would my son and his wife. I didn't tell them right away. I wanted them to feel the weight the same way I had, in silence, in the middle of a day they thought was theirs to control. That week, I stayed quiet. I still slept in the shed. I still swept the patio, but every step I took with the knowledge that I wasn't just an old woman squatting behind someone else's life. I was the co-owner of everything they took for granted, and now the law remembered what they chose to forget. The shed was quiet that night. Too quiet for sleep. I sat at the small folding table they had tossed in with the cot, its legs uneven on the wooden floor, creaking each time I shifted my weight. The laptop rested in front of me, an old hand-me-down model that took 10 minutes to boot and hummed like a microwave, but it worked. I logged into the mortgage account. Still joint access, still my name on the welcome screen next to my son's. I clicked through each tab slowly, methodically. Account summary, payment history, property documents. I reread the instructions Sarah had sent, checked the timestamp on the injunction approval, then hovered my cursor over the account action drop-down. Request freeze due to ownership dispute, it said. My finger trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what came next. I thought of Robert's voice in my ear. No one gets to erase you unless you hand them the pen. I clicked. The screen froze for a second, then blinked. A message popped up. Your request has been submitted. Processing time, 12:20, 24 hours. I leaned back and exhaled. The room was lit only by the pale glow of the screen. Shadows danced across the shed walls, making everything feel a little larger than it was. I shut the laptop and listened to the night. My body ached from the cot, from the cold, from the months of swallowing every insult they flung like breadcrumbs. But my name was still on the loan, and now the bank knew it too. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't need to. I sat by the window with my notebook, watching the night roll over the hills, waiting for the sun to rise, like I used to wait for bread to rise in the oven, quiet, patient, certain. By morning, the house was humming. I walked toward the back porch with my mug of black coffee, steam rising in the golden light. I saw my daughter-in-law pacing by the kitchen window, phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp even through the glass. "What do you mean, frozen? We didn't authorize anything. This must be a mistake. My husband's the one who pays." My son appeared behind her, hair disheveled, voice tight. "Call the bank again. Tell them it's urgent. This is our mortgage. We make the payments." I took a sip of my coffee and sat on the patio bench. They burst out the back door 10 minutes later. She saw me first. "You," she hissed, pointing. "Did you do something? Because they're saying the account is locked. They won't let us transfer funds." I didn't answer. She stepped closer. "Why would you do this? Do you want us to lose the house? Are you trying to ruin us?" My son rubbed his forehead. "Ma, talk to me. Did you file something?" I set my mug down gently. "I froze the mortgage account," I said, "because I still exist." Silence fell like a dropped plate. "You don't get to make decisions like that," she shouted. "You live in a shed." I looked at her. "I also live on the deed." My son opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "You forgot," I continued, "that I built this house with your father. You forgot that I signed the same line you did. You forgot that just because I stopped speaking doesn't mean I stopped mattering." She looked at him, eyes wide, desperate. "You said she wasn't on the title anymore." "She was supposed to be," he muttered. I stood up, brushed off my skirt, and walked past them toward the garden. The sun was warm on my face. The shed was still behind me. The house was still full of noise. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one being erased. I was the one drawing the line. They spent the next 48 hours scrambling. I watched from the garden bench as my son stormed back and forth through the yard, barking into his phone. I could hear every third word: escrow, unfreezing, mistake, emergency. My daughter-in-law hovered near the porch, tapping furiously at her iPad, lips tight, jaw clenched. She looked like someone watching their vacation home burn, only this time the flames weren't visible, just legal. On the third day, they called their own lawyer. He arrived in a silver car that cost more than my first house, wearing a suit too polished for a dirt driveway. They huddled inside for hours. I sat under the magnolia tree with a cup of tea, humming to myself and trimming deadheads from the petunias. When the screen door slammed and she marched toward me, I knew the storm had landed. "You had no right," she hissed. "Our attorney says this is a gross abuse of legal process." I looked up from my tea. She jabbed a finger in the air. "We're filing to reverse the injunction immediately, and if you don't lift it yourself, you'll be hearing from a judge. You think you're clever? You think this is funny?" I stirred my tea. She turned to my son, who had followed behind her, looking pale. "Say something to her." He swallowed hard. "Ma, you're making things worse than they have to be. The bank flagged the account. We can't get the refinance through. Our credit score is already down 30 points. I set the spoon down gently. "Would you like to see the documents?" I asked. They stared. I rose and walked back to the shed, returned with a plastic accordion file, faded pink. I laid it on the patio table, unfolded it slowly. First came the mortgage deed with both our names. Then the email thread with Sarah, outlining my legal position. Then the stamped copy of the injunction order, temporary but enforceable. And finally, the screenshot of the mortgage portal, showing my login credentials and the freeze status, marked in red, "Joint Owner Action Dispute Filed." Their lawyer arrived just as my son was flipping through the papers. "Mrs. Smith," he said, adjusting his tie, "surely there's a more amicable path we can pursue. This is adversarial." "No," I said softly, "this is protective." My daughter-in-law clenched her fists. "So you're just going to ruin us? Out of spite?" I folded my hands. "No, out of self-respect." The lawyer stepped back. My son stared at the table. He didn't speak again. Later that evening, I received 3 emails from the mortgage company, 2 from the bank, and 1 certified letter from the court, acknowledging that all documents were in order. The freeze would remain until the issue of co-ownership was legally resolved. I poured myself another cup of tea, sat by the window in the shed, and watched the sun slip behind the roofline of the house I still partly owned. They could scream, call lawyers, threaten all they wanted, but now they knew. I was not just a burden. I was a barrier they could not bulldoze. We didn't speak for 3 days. The shed had grown quiet again, not with sorrow this time, but with a kind of calm before resolution. I made tea each morning, clipped herbs from the planters by the fence, and watched them from the distance of legality. They knew now. They had no choice. On the 4th morning, they came to me, together. My son held a folder in one hand, his wedding ring catching the light. My daughter-in-law stood behind him, face tight, lips thinned into a line that barely resembled a smile. "We want to talk," he said. I nodded, I figured. They sat at the patio table, while I remained standing, the distance between us a silent reminder of everything they had said and everything I had endured. "We're willing," he began, "to come to terms. A compromise." I said nothing. "If you remove the freeze," she added, "we'll formalize a living arrangement for you. You can have the shed permanently. We'll renovate it, make it livable." I sipped my tea. "No," I said softly. Their faces stiffened. "I'm not a dog in a kennel," I continued. "I won't sign anything that gives you the right to cage me at your convenience." My son looked confused. "Then what do you want?" I laid the papers down on the table. "Mother's first right," I said. "It's a legal amendment to the mortgage agreement, the property deed, and any refinancing going forward." My daughter-in-law scoffed. "What does that even mean?" "It means," I said, "that I am guaranteed residence in this home for the remainder of my life unless I choose otherwise. It means any major decision, sale, refinance, structural change, must come through me first, not after, not in secret, first." She stared at the document. And this, I added, unfolding another page, is a statement of damages. Emotional, financial, physical. I won't sue, I won't go public, but you will sign this acknowledgement and pay me a modest settlement. In cash. My son paled. You're blackmailing us. No, I said. I'm balancing the scales. They were silent for a long time. The risk to them was clear. Their credit was bleeding. Their options were limited, and if this dragged out, I would win, not just in court, but in the eyes of every neighbor, every co-worker, every curious cousin who would wonder why the bank seized their perfect home. She signed first. Angrily, sloppily, he followed, slower, more pained. I waited until every line was initialed. Then I signed my name. Strong, clear. Sarah emailed me 5 minutes later. You did it, she wrote. I folded the papers, placed them in my file box, and walked back to the shed. Only, it was no longer a shed. Over the past week, while they were busy unraveling, I had begun to fix it. A neighbor installed insulation, another helped me string fairy lights around the ceiling beams. A retired carpenter added a proper lock, a fresh coat of blue paint, and a bookshelf by the window. Sarah asked if I were Hope yet. And I am, I replied. I remember asking, am I really going to be fairy girl again? Put carpet on the window. It had heat now. A reading lamp. A soft chair. My tea set. It was mine. As I sat in the doorway, the signed documents tucked beneath my hand, I felt something lift. Not triumph, but dignity. They had tried to make me invisible. Now, by law, I could no longer be ignored. They thought they were punishing me when they sent me to the shed. They never imagined I would turn it into a sanctuary and sign their surrender at the garden table. The shed, now painted sky blue with white trim, overlooked the small pond at the edge of the property. My favorite view. It caught the sunrise just right and made the steam from my morning tea look like a blessing. It no longer smelled like oil and mildew. It smelled like lavender and lemon balm. I had planted a row of herbs along the path and installed a rocking chair by the door. The fairy lights twinkled at night like my own little constellation, and the inside was lined with books, blankets, and peace. Every Saturday morning, I hosted what we called Shed Circle. Just 3 or 4 women at first, widows, retirees, one nurse on leave. We talked about our aches, our grandchildren, our memories. I told them about the mortgage, about the night I froze the account, about the day they called me a burden. By the 3rd month, there were 12 of us. One of the local papers caught wind of the story, an anonymous tip. Widow wins quiet war with her mortgage. It wasn't sensational, it was surgical. They never mentioned my son's name or my daughter-in-law's, but everyone in town could guess. People began to treat me differently. Neighbors who used to wave politely now lingered longer at the fence. A woman from church brought me fresh preserves just because. The mailman called me Miss Firstright with a smile. The shift wasn't loud, it was warm. Then came the first dinner invitation. Not from a friend, from the house. My grandson, bless him, walked down to the shed one afternoon with a folded note in his pocket. "Grandma," he said, "they're having a family dinner. Mom says you should come." I took the note and thanked him. It was handwritten, probably my son's doing, just a simple invite. "You're welcome to join us at 6. I wore a green cardigan and brought my own rolls. I walked into the house at 5:58. No one rushed to greet me, but no one stopped me either. The table was set for 6. I took my seat without asking. No one dared to place me at the fold-out table with the kids. The meal was awkward. My daughter-in-law commented on the weather. My son asked if the heater in the shed was holding up. I nodded, said little. But when the meal ended and everyone began clearing plates, I stood up and said, "I'd like to invite you all to dinner." They froze. "My treat," I added. "You can bring your parents too. I believe family should be hosted with dignity." No one spoke. They just nodded. And that was enough. The next night I cooked in my little shed kitchen. Rosemary chicken, roasted carrots, sweet potato casserole. I served it under the string lights, with cloth napkins and real china. They sat quietly, awkward at first, but slowly something softened. The wind that night was gentle, the food was warm. And the burden? It was finally theirs to carry, for once. And I just rocked in my chair, a quiet smile on my lips, while the world caught up to what I had always known. Respect doesn't shout, it waits. The day I signed my new will, it was raining, the soft kind that taps gently on the roof like an old friend checking in. I stood at the threshold of the shed, watching the garden soak in the water. The marigolds dropped slightly, but I knew they'd be standing proud again by morning. In my hand was the folder from my attorney, still warm from the printer. Inside was the culmination of months of quiet decisions. The will named no heirs in the traditional sense. My son and daughter-in-law were not mentioned. Not out of anger, but clarity. What they had taken from me was never meant to be restored. What I reclaimed, I intended to give forward. The settlement they'd been forced to pay, combined with the remainder of my mortgage claim and some savings I'd never touched, now formed the core of something new, the Eloise Smith Foundation. Not flashy, not enormous, but powerful in its intent. To turn forgotten corners, sheds, porches, unused guest rooms, into sanctuaries for elders like me, people discarded by their families, people erased by bureaucracy, people who still had lives to live, lessons to teach, and dignity to preserve. And this very shed, this once damp, oil-smelling outbuilding, would be the pilot site. I'd already begun remodeling. What started with insulation and fairy lights had become a true transformation. Local volunteers pitched in. Some of the same neighbors who had once walked past my exile in silence now came with tool belts and tile samples. We turned the shed into something worthy. The inside glowed with honey-colored wood. Books lined the walls, a kettle sat on a dedicated shelf. A small desk faced the pond, and there were 2 comfortable chairs that faced one another, ready for conversation. The window was now double-paned. A mural covered one outer wall, a tree whose roots turned into hands. We named it the Root Room, a place where no one's age determined their worth, a space for stories, healing, and beginning again. After I filed the foundation papers, I returned home and poured myself a cup of mint tea. I stood in front of the old mirror, the one that used to hang in the hallway of the big house, before she said it clashed with her modern aesthetic. I rescued it the day they packed my things in boxes and left them outside the door. It had a small crack in the corner, but it still held the truth. I looked at my reflection, face lined, hair soft gray, eyes steady, and I said as softly as breath, "They thought I could sleep in a shed." I turned that shed into my throne. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The words weren't boastful. They were a reminder. To myself, to any woman who's ever been pushed aside, to anyone listening now, you are allowed to take the thing they gave you to break your spirit and turn it into the thing that sets you free. You are allowed to rise from insult without a single scream. That fall, a young woman named Cassie moved into the neighborhood. She was caring for her mother, a stroke survivor, and was overwhelmed with the weight of everything. Job, bills, caregiving. Someone from the garden circle sent her my way. Cassie and I met for tea. She cried in the root room. I listened. Then I gave her the foundation's first grant check. "Fix your plumbing," I told her. "Then come back and plant tomatoes with me in the spring." She did. The tomatoes grew thick and sweet. People started visiting the shed not just to sit, but to write, to read, to breathe. I hosted quiet hours, wrote newsletters, answered emails from strangers across the country. Some asked how I found the strength, and I told them the truth. It wasn't strength. It was memory. I remembered who I was before they tried to convince me otherwise. I remembered the kitchen I'd built, the nights I held babies on my chest, the check I wrote to save the house from foreclosure 15 years ago, and I remembered signing that mortgage document with hope in my heart. Hope that came back to save me when they thought I'd forgotten everything. There is power in paperwork, yes, but there is more power in remembering your own name when they stop using it. The last entry in my journal for that year reads, "I am not a cautionary tale. I am a blueprint, and blueprints are how you rebuild." As the foundation grew, the press called again. This time I said yes. They filmed a short piece, simple, nothing fancy. I wore my green cardigan and sat on the porch of the shed. They asked me what I'd say to someone who'd just been handed the keys to a back shed and told to go live there. I looked into the camera, and I said, "Take the key, open the door, then change the locks, make it yours, and when you're ready, invite others in." That clip spread faster than I imagined. Soon after, a woman from Mississippi reached out, then one from Vermont, a man in Arizona who'd been told by his daughter to just be grateful for the couch. They wrote letters, sent photos, and the root room became more than just a room. It became a movement, not loud, but undeniable. I never intended to become a symbol. Symbols are carved from tragedy or myth, and I was simply a woman who once said yes when I should have said not yet. I had a house, a son, a few forgotten dreams, and a shed they thought could hold me. But when you plant your dignity in the dark, when you water it with silence and name it truth, it grows. It was supposed to end with the shed, but it didn't. A month after the local news piece aired, I received a letter from a city councilwoman. She had watched the segment twice and wanted to meet. "I believe what you've created has the potential to change things," she wrote. "Would you be open to a conversation?" I made sweet tea and lemon bread. She came alone, without staff or camera crews, and sat across from me on the porch of what we now called the root room. She didn't talk politics. She didn't make promises. She just asked questions. What would it take to replicate this? Could we scale it? How many elders are silently sleeping in sheds that look just like this one? I didn't have numbers, but I had names. I told her about Frances, who slept in a camper behind her daughter's house in Mississippi and washed her clothes with a garden hose. About Gerald in New Mexico, who shared a bunk bed with his grandson while his son drove a Tesla. About Linda, whose daughter posted videos of her silly old mom for likes while refusing to let her back into the kitchen. I told her that what I'd done wasn't unique, it was just documented. Most women like me fade in corners. We don't make noise. We don't threaten lawsuits. We fold napkins, swallow insults, and shrink until the space they give us is enough. Unless we remember that we built the table. She asked what I wanted next. I looked at her and said, "More chairs." By spring, we had them. The root room became the blueprint for a small but growing network of satellite sheds, each one different, each one sacred. Some were in backyards. Some were tiny homes. Some were remodeled porches with bookcases and electric kettles. But each one bore the name of someone who once refused to disappear. Each one started with a woman who remembered her worth. One of them wrote me a letter. They gave me a closet and called it compassion. Now I have a room with a lock, a lamp, and a nameplate. I'm 68. I finally feel like I've come home. I cried when I read that one, not because it was sad, but because it was victory wrapped in a single paragraph. We held the first throne circle that fall. 15 women from across 5 states gathered at the root room. We shared meals, traded stories, wrote letters to our younger selves. I watched them laugh, cry, heal. I watched them pass the talking stick like it was a torch. One night, we sat under the stars, blankets on our laps, cider in hand, and someone asked me. I hadn't thought about it that way. I stared at the flames in the fire pit for a long moment. I might have faded, I said. That silence I once thought was safety? It would have become erasure. The truth is, the signature they needed to borrow from me became the very thing that saved me, not because it was legal, but because it was remembered. That's what no one tells you about aging. It's not your knees that betray you first. It's the world's memory of who you used to be. But I remembered. And in remembering, I wrote myself back into the story. Now, women like me write too. Every throne room keeps a journal, a shared one. Visitors write entries, notes, poems, even prayers. Some are funny, some are full of rage, some are nothing but a single sentence. Today, I was not invisible. We scan them, archive them. I read them aloud in our circles. Someday I'll publish them all. I've also started mentoring. Young women come now, granddaughters, volunteers, social workers. They sit with me and ask what to look for in contracts, how to protect their mothers, how to protect themselves. And I tell them, sign wisely, speak early, document everything. Do not confuse silence with safety, and above all, if they ever tell you to sleep in the shed, make it a throne. I still rock in my chair every morning. Still drink my tea just the way Robert liked it, strong, no sugar. Still keep a soft cardigan draped on the hook by the door. But I no longer sit alone. Every day, someone comes. With a story, a question, a truth they've waited too long to speak. I listen, because I know what it means to be heard after the world has spent years talking over you. So if you're hearing this, if your hands are tired, your name has been spoken too rarely, and your value has been measured by how much you clean instead of how much you remember, take heart, take breath, take space. You are allowed to stay, to sign, to speak. And if they ever give you a shed, build roots. If they mock your past, plant seeds. If they call you a burden, let them feel your weight. And when you rise, and you will, bring others with you. Because dignity grows best when shared. Because you're not just a woman with a story. You're the blueprint. You're the throne. And the world, it's finally watching. Now make them listen. And so if you've made it this far, if something in this story reminded you of a mother, a grandmother, or a version of yourself you thought had disappeared, then I hope you know this. It is never too late to reclaim what they buried. It is never too late to stand, even if you're trembling. And it is never too late to turn a shed into something sacred. If you want to hear more stories like mine, real, quiet, powerful, then subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Because the world may forget what you've done, but when a grandma speaks, she rebuilds the silence into something you'll never forget.